Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative on location, the Teaching Comics Through a Historical Context Panel at HeroesCon 2015. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, you're going to be listening to a recording of a panel that both Andy and I were on last week at HeroesCon. But before we get to that recording, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative on Location is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials, and June is no exception. Now, sometimes you'll find that those specials are 45% off cover price, sometimes 50% off, but many times the discounts are more impressive than that.
That's right, and as usual, they have a load of bundles where you can get a deeper discount on several of their new comics that from the same publisher than you would get if you ordered those comics individually. And this month they have bundle discounts from DC, from Valiant, from Marvel, and other publishers. So check those out if you want to get some good deals on some bundles.
That's right, and we're in the last days of June, but that's okay with the people at Discount Comic Book Service because they do not mind late orders, and I should know because I often order late. So go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, this is the first time we've been on a show together post-HeroesCon. Have you acclimated to life after the con?
I guess, sort of, a little bit. I don't know. I still feel like I just got back, and I'm working my way through the stuff that I bought there as well. How about you?
Yeah, I had to plunge back into work the day I returned, so I had to get over it. So I feel like it's been a long time since I got back from the con, just having to get back in the day-to-day groove of work. But man, when we were down there that weekend, it seemed to fly by for me.
Yeah, the weekend went by really, really quickly for me as well. And in fact, when I got to the end, I wasn't even sure. I realized I had kind of not done some things that I wanted to do, so that happens.
Yeah, I know that you and I were talking before we turned on the recorder that you had a few regrets of things that you couldn't do or didn't do when you were down there. And I've been thinking of the same thing, people that I wanted to see or books that I wanted to check into but just didn't get around to it. But I still feel like I did a lot.
Yeah, I feel like I did a lot too, and got to see some people and have some fun especially getting to see the people that are kind of my regular, I guess what I might call HeroesCon friends, the people I only see every year at HeroesCon, but because we've been there every year, I've kind of gotten to know them. Mm-hmm. And we hang out online maybe during the regular year, and then we get to meet face-to-face at HeroesCon.
Were many of those people at the panel we were on?
No, but the panel we were on, if we're going to transition into introducing that, but the panel that we were on had everybody on that panel I knew already. Now, I don't think that's the same for you, right?
Right. I think everyone there I had met for the first time last week.
Yeah. So,
except for you, of course.
Yeah, except for me. So to kind of introduce this panel, so we were on a panel called Teaching Comics Through a Historical Context, and featured on this panel were Will Allred, who is a comics scholar. He got his PhD from the University of Arkansas, and he currently teaches at a local community college there. And he has also been a contributor to the various encyclopedia projects that Keith Booker has edited that I've also participated in. So I got to know him through that first, and then met him at HeroesCon a few times. And this is, I think, the second panel that he and I have done together.
Okay.
And then also on that panel was Brian Puaca, who teaches history at Christopher Newport University. Also the second time I've been on a panel with him. And as you'll listen to this episode, I was glad to have Brian's perspective from a historian rather than from an English lit person, which is normally the type of person I talk to about teaching comics. Mm-hmm. And then you were on that panel, and then Tom Heintjes, who's legendary comics historian and publisher of the Hogan's Alley magazine. So it was good to have a kind of non-academic perspective, though he kind of apologized at the beginning for being a non-academic. I think before we started recording the panel, I kind of referred to him as a proto-academic, because I think that the kind of work that he's done for decades as a comics historian is invaluable, and I think underappreciated in comic studies. So it was good to have him on there. And then the panel was moderated by Shawn Daughhetee, who is part of the Dollar Bin podcast.
Yeah, and in fact, we should say that the Dollar Bin podcast, they were the ones who recorded the panel that you're about to hear, and they were kind enough to share it with us. So thanks to the guys at the Dollar Bin podcast. You mentioned something about Tom saying that he's not an academic. I think it's healthy for academics in their discussion to have non-academics as part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's true.
Holds our feet to the fire.
Yeah, and also, not only holds our feet to the fire, but to mix metaphors a bit, keeps us grounded as well. It I think prevents us from getting too much into the kind of jargony academic stuff that we might do at a conference rather than at a convention.
Exactly. But yeah, I think that even given that there were mostly academics on the panel, I think we did keep the rhetoric grounded.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a freewheeling conversation, and so, but I think it's a good one, and I think it was fun as usual. Shawn has organized the Teaching Comics panel now for at least the last 3 or 4 years. I've been on it. I think this is my 4th time. I'm trying to remember. I think that's the case.
Wow.
And so I mentioned, I think early in the panel, that the topic of canon comes up right away. Mm-hmm. And that's for people who may have never not gotten into the continuity of the Teaching Comics panel at HeroesCon. That is something that has come up every year for the last 4 years. almost right away, and had become a kind of focus of several of the early panels. So I was a little bemused by the fact that came up right away.
Yeah, and you made that comment, I remember.
Yeah.
And this is the first time that I was on this panel. They asked me to be part of one last year, but I just couldn't make it to Charlotte then. But this year, I was on it. I had a great time, and I'd like to do this again at some point because I think it was a great experience.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Well, let's let everyone hear what we're referring to now.
Yeah, go ahead and play it.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is a panel in the Teaching Comics series we've been doing for about 5 years now, I think. This is putting comics into a historical context. So thank you for joining us. We will be recording this panel, so if you guys want to listen to it later, come back to it, or share it with friends, we'll have it up. My name is Shawn Daughhetee. I'm with the Dollar Bin, and I also used to work for Heroes Aren't Hard to Find, kind of with the store and the convention. And I would like to introduce the panelists, or have the panelists introduce themselves. So if you guys want to start, give a short introduction, name, and kind of any relevant information.
Okay. My name is Derek Royal. I'm one of the co-hosts of the podcast, The Comics Alternative. I'm also editorial director of Brown Books, based out of Dallas, Texas. And I have been a comics scholar for the past, 5-8 years, something like that. Started off traditional literary studies and then evolved into comic studies.
And I'm Andy Kunka. I also co-host the Comics Alternative podcast with Derek, and I have a PhD in 20th century British literature, but once I got tenure, decided I was teaching comics, and that's what I've done pretty much since then. And I teach at the University of South Carolina's Sumter campus.
I'll repeat that theme. My name is Brian Puaca. I'm a historian at the Christopher Newport University in Newport News. I have a PhD in German history, modern German history, and I also teach a class on the history of comics. I also got tenure, and they gave me a little bit of a leash. And it's been great fun, and I emphasize working with primary sources in the classroom. And so it's a fun course for our students to take on their way up the major chain.
And I'm Tom Heintjes. I publish Hogan's Alley magazine. I've been joking that I'm the token non-academic here on the panel. But I started Hogan's Alley because nobody was publishing a magazine that I felt placed comics into a proper historical and cultural context in the way that I thought that they needed to be treated. So I started Hogan's Alley to try to further that understanding.
I'm Will Allred. I got my PhD in English lit, 20th century science fiction, that stuff. And they actually let me write about comics for my PhD. Suckers. And I teach at Northwest Arkansas Community College as an adjunct. And one of the classes they let me teach is comics and graphic novels, which is a tremendous amount of fun.
Awesome. We got some pretty high-level thinkers on the panel. This is great. I'm excited. So let's just jump right on into it. So when you guys teach comics, for an example, say Watchmen, how do you guys approach it? Do you teach the history behind it and the historical context within the history of the time period, the importance within the comics history, or do you kind of piece it out bit by bit? You let them read a little bit, then you give them the context to kind of influence what they've read. So how do you guys approach educating people with comics in that kind of sense? Who wants to jump in on this first?
I'll just say I teach Watchmen, I guess, pretty regularly. So to focus in on that, in that question, I usually start the first day dealing with this context. So I talk about Alan Moore's career, what it meant, and as myself as a reader, growing up at the time, as a teenager when Alan Moore started working on Swamp Thing, and that blew me away right away. so to talk about that kind of context, what it was it like to be a reader at the time that Alan Moore started at DC, and what Watchmen meant in that part of his career. So there's that. There's the formal experiments that Watchmen does that I try to fit into a historical context as well. What does it mean that there's no sound effects and thought balloons in the book? How do we read the nine panel grid in relationship to other comics? And then there's the 1986 context. How do you talk about 1986 to a group of students who weren't born then? What did it mean, in that book, for example, for Nixon to be president still? What impact that would have had on people who grew up through the Nixon presidency instead of people who only know it historically?
I do something similar to Andy. Whenever I've taught Watchmen, I guess I would break down my critical trajectories in the classroom into three directions. Usually I start with an aesthetic approach, and if I do that, often I will set up, especially if it's an introduction to comics class, I might have the students read something like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and then use a text like Watchmen to see how some of those concepts play out. So I'll use that as an example. But in the other two trajectories, I definitely bring history into the course discussion. I think it's great to talk about Watchmen as a commentary on the superhero genre. There you're dealing with the history of comics, and so you can bring in history as it specifically deals with the comics medium. But then I also do what Andy mentions and bring in the 1980s. What does it mean that we have a President Nixon? What does it say about 1980 politics, Reagan's America, and all of that? So history, I've never taught Watchmen without some kind of historical emphasis in some way or another.
I guess I kind of walk the line between the two in the sense that I obviously teaching a class that's a history class, everything is set up in terms of context and making sure they understand how the assignment for that day fits into the bigger picture of, as it is, America since the 1930s for my class from the Depression. But I also try to make sure that there's enough left unsaid so that when we do discuss the sources, they're making insights and bringing their own interpretations to it without feeling like they've been spoon-fed the material. I don't know if Watchmen works quite as well for me when I talk about this, but to switch topics, if you don't mind context, Superman #1 is one of the assignments I have the students read, and we talk about the Depression as kind of a framing device for that. And then we talk about in class some of the things that they see that maybe surprise them about who the villains are. And we obviously talk about who, in terms of authorship, who are the people who created the document and what are they doing and why are they doing it and what are their messages and feelings. And we obviously talk about the fact that there's a lot of class conflict here, and this is something that is the bad guys in these early issues are corrupt mine owners and are people who do things that are detrimental to the average working class kind of person Superman's trying to represent. So having them pull those things out of there with the Depression as a background kind of makes them, I think, feel more active in the reading that they're doing.
Brian, where in the semester do you place Watchmen?
Watchmen for me is at the end, but it fits chronologically more or less pretty well at the end, because at the end of the class we kind of talk about the development of the graphic novel, and we do it in a couple different stages. I do graphic novel in superheroes, which is Watchmen in the 80s and 90s towards the end of the class. We do graphic novels in history, and I have them read Maus. And the one that I've been kind of tinkering with the most is I do a week on graphic novels and autobiography. And I've had them reading for the last couple of years. I've taught the class Blankets, which is a book they really respond to well, and I think that their age group likes it a lot. I don't know that it's my favorite necessarily. Mm-hmm. I've been tinkering with substituting Fun Home there. I have not done that yet, but it's something that would certainly, I think that would be interesting to them, because obviously one of the issues that comes up, even with Blankets, is censorship. And so, kind of talking about that as well toward the end of the semester with misunderstandings and misconceptions about comics, it kind of is very timely.
Well, for what it's worth, you mentioned Blankets and then possibly Fun Home. One year I taught Blankets and then Fun Home immediately after. Everyone fell in love with Blankets, and in comparison, Fun Home fell flat, and I was dealing with a fairly conservative student body, and so I think that there were some issues that they couldn't get around there, but I vowed never to teach those two back to back again for that reason, because of the reaction I got from that.
Huh. Interesting.
It was curious.
Have any of you ever taught a book called Stitches by David Small?
I haven't taught it, but I've thought about teaching it. It's pretty brutal.
It is. It is. Well, I'm on the record as not having taught, not being an academic, but
You're an educator.
You're an educator.
I wanted to ask the academics here, is there a difference between teaching something that most people are probably familiar with, like Watchmen, versus selecting something that might have less familiarity coming in, and do they respond differently to the lessons that you try to impart?
And this is something we talk on the podcast often. And whenever I teach, I try not to teach those that I tend to call the usual suspects, like mouse being one, because chances are a good number of the students already know those anyhow. So why not introduce something new to them? Not that the others that they may be familiar with aren't wonderful graphic novels, comics, what have you, but there's so many like Stitches, and that's a perfect example that people just aren't aware of. And I think using them in the classroom, with a historical context or otherwise, I think is doing our students a service.
So Shawn, we got to the question of canon so fast. It's like every year.
Every year. It always hits like, all right, what do you teach? What are the top? Yeah, it does. It's a subject and a theme that runs throughout the teaching comics panels.
For me, mine is more of a survey class that I'm teaching more as an introduction to comics and graphic novels. So I am going with a lot of the well-known works. And for me, teaching something like Mouse, getting into the history is so important. The context is so important for Mouse. And even for Watchmen, talking about crime in the 80s. I mean, because it is, Watchmen at its heart is a mystery, sort of a mystery, and it deals. Sorry, I have to ask this. When you teach Watchmen, does everybody just go, Rorschach is the greatest? I'm like, why are you guys doing that? Moore did not mean for him to be as well loved but the students, they really responded to Rorschach. And I try to, explain to them, what tradition he's coming out of, talk about, quality, talk about the question, and that, which of course leads into Ditko and all this stuff. So there's a lot of comics history just balled up in Watchmen. And then there's a lot of just history balled up in Watchmen. You mentioned Nixon is still president, and some of the things that Gibbons does with, there's electric power everywhere because we have Dr. Manhattan, and all these really cool cultural things that they do inside the work that, did the students catch that? And if they did, what did they make out of it? It's a really interesting work.
One of the quiz questions I always ask with Watchmen, the quiz doesn't count for anything. I should point out. Just it's more fun for me to do. Is what celebrity actor with the initials RR runs for president at the end of Watchmen? And it's Robert Redford. That joke's really funny to me. They don't know that there wasn't necessarily was a president with the initials RR.
Oh man. So I'm going to take the stance that comics are an effective way to teach history. So do you guys agree with that statement? And if so, kind of why? Is it the visual medium? Is it the ability to kind of have this juxtaposition between images and text? You guys want to kind of talk a little bit about kind of how to effectively use comics to teach history?
Well, I guess I'll start, because I'm the guy with the history thing on top of the syllabus thing. I'm in summer mode already. I guess what I would say is, obviously I have to agree with that statement. And for me, I think the reason is that it allows us to do the kinds of things that we do as historians in terms of interpreting and analyzing primary sources, but in a very unusual, but also very, I think, accessible way for the students who are in the class. The kinds of questions that we ask, at least in my class, in terms of the things we're reading, are the same that you would ask if you read a speech from Abraham Lincoln or if you were interpreting photographs from the Depression. You ask questions of authorship and message and bias and reception and audience. And these are things that you do with comics that the first couple of classes, I find the students are a little bit skeptical. I think maybe partly that's parents, maybe partly that's, they're surprised that the Iron Man movie they saw in the theaters could somehow translate into something academic in some distant way. But we talk about the Cold War, and we talk about Iron Man, and we talk about the ways in which, these 60s themes kind of came up and how they were received and what was going on there. And I think the students find in the end that it's actually a very interesting and a very valuable way to do it. And the best part is having students in my classes who go on to become teachers say things to me like, I think it'd be really neat to talk about Captain America #1 in my class when we talk about America in World War II. That's neat when we talk about isolationism and we talk about anti-Semitism in the United States. And, I talk about the German-American blend in my class. When they can find things from my class to use in their classes as a high school teacher, I think that's fascinating. So,
I often find myself, Roy Thomas comes to this show, and I've had the chance to say to him, I know more about World War II history because I read The Invaders and All-Star Squadron in the 80s than I got from any history class I ever took. And you get to learn, at one point, I don't know it anymore, I could recite, Roosevelt's cabinet because they all showed up in that comic.
One thing I try to do in Hogan's Alley especially is present articles that challenge a reader assumption. We ran a really long article in our 12th issue about the Song of the South. Which has a lot of baggage and is a complicated work. But if you look at the history of the Song of the South, Disney tried to do the right thing and reach out to civil rights leaders and place it in a context that would make it a mainstream acceptable movie and not with all the baggage that we see today. Art is a product of its era. It's a product of its social context. And that's true for the Song of the South, too. And we had a big discussion in the office when we had the opportunity to publish this article. Do we want to publish 26,000 words about Song of the South? Ultimately, we did, and it was really well received. And I think that it sort of gave people a deeper understanding of, because you can't really even, you can buy it now, but it's not easy. But it's sort of this thing you hear about but never really experience anymore. But to make people understand the social context, the historical context, the corporate efforts that went into making it an acceptable piece of art, I think it challenged a lot of people's assumptions about, the origins of art and what companies try to do to put it before an audience in a way that is acceptable. That we've lost a lot of that understanding about Song of the South today. So something like that, I think, challenged a lot of the assumptions about Song of the South, just to cite one example.
Well, from my standpoint, my dissertation director and the person most responsible for my degree is a Marxist scholar, and I kind of count myself as a Marxist scholar too, and historical context is everything. And the medium itself, for me, I see as, it taught me to read. It's so accessible. And I don't want to bag on historians, I promise, but I've read some pretty dry history books in the course of my life. And the thing that comics, then I've read, of course, dry comics as well, but comics has that unique combination where it can almost bring history to life, I think, in a way that you don't quite get from just text. Now, I'm not saying that Action Comics #1 is true to life and we should study that as what happened, but it does, you mentioned earlier, it was very much a product of the working class, and that's what Siegel and Schuster were. And then I wanted to ask you, so I'm going to do it right now, did you bring in Morrison's kind of reboot where he moved Superman back to kind of that, pardon my French here, but that Midwestern Hellraiser, which is what Superman really started out as?
I find myself pressed for time in the class.
Okay.
So, no, if they let me teach it as a 2-semester class, I have a whole lot more flexibility. Maybe the administrators will hear this recording, give me a longer leash. That'd be fun to do, but the list of things I'd like to add on is long. I haven't done that.
we've been talking primarily about, taking comics that aren't necessarily histories, but seeing history in them, looking at the context, and as, using those texts, whether it be Watchmen, Song of the South, animation, or other texts, Action Comics #1, and seeing how it effectively teases out our understanding of history and questions our assumptions of that. I think another way of approaching this, and I've done this before in the classroom, is to use comics or graphic novels, if you want to call them that are actual histories. I know one that at the very first semester that I taught a course devoted to comics, I used H. Anderson's King, which is a biography of Martin Luther King. And it's one that I found that a lot of people don't know about. My students definitely didn't know about. But I think it was a great example to use in the classroom, because not only was I able to bring in discussions of, aesthetics and what Anderson is doing by using collage and different kind of styles, which is all fun to do. But, it's a biography, and a biography is a form of a history. And one of the things that a text like King does is that it foregrounds the constructiveness of history, how we put history together, which is very similar to what we in literary studies do, in that how are stories put together. I put a lot of stock in Hayden White in his new historicist approach in looking at history as probably most effective when it is a narrative, and narrative is a way that we not only talk about ourselves and our culture, but our very identities, both individual, communal and national. And coming back to King, one of the things that's so effective about that text is that Anderson does use this collage approach to telling the story of Martin Luther King. And the way that I deal with that is that there's not just one single story that narrates a particular life, very similar to an understanding of there's no one single narrative that tells us who we are as a country or who we are as a particular culture, that there are different facets to that. And I think looking at how Anderson puts together his biography of Martin Luther King tells us in some ways how we put together our own histories, the history of an individual. Something very similar is going on with the book that we reviewed on the podcast not too long ago, Operation Nemesis. That was written by Josh Blaylock and Hoyt Silva, and that is about the Armenian massacre at the early part of the 20th century. And one of the things that we discussed on that show was that the story shifts from a first-person account, not only textually, but also visually, and then almost a detached third-person omniscient point of view. And I think that that's an effective way of telling that story because, first and foremost, it doesn't overly bias the narrative about the history of the Armenian massacre. So the guys go back and forth between a very personal story and something that's a little more godlike and detached. But I think in a grander way, it tells us something about different ways of approaching history and how history or our stories are written. It's not just this one singular narrative focalized way of doing it, but you can come at it from different angles, and that together is a history.
If I can branch off that, last summer I moderated a panel with Congressman John Lewis and Andrew Iden, who was his co-author on March. And he said that he has a concern that the lessons of the civil rights movement are largely being forgotten by young people who are not as mindful of the sacrifices that were made that we take for granted today. So they, in part, devised March as a way to reach young people because they felt that a graphic novel would be an appealing way to impart this lesson to them, the lesson of history of the civil rights movement. And as a result, every incoming freshman at Georgia State University receives a free copy of March upon matriculation. So it's been proven that it is a very effective way to reach people, and part of its mission is to teach them, what went on before them that helped us get to where we are today.
I'd like to think even academic historians are realizing the value of this. There's a new series, Oxford University Press has put out a new series of books that involve a historian working with comics creators, and it's a kind of a two-part book. The first part of the book has basically a comic version of some important historical story, a narrative that's constructed through documents that the historian works with the creator to put together. And the second half of the book includes the actual primary sources the historian used and spoke with the creator about in order to create the story, but allows you, the reader, to then look at them and kind of draw some of your own conclusions. And there's 3 or 4 of these out now, but from Oxford, and they're great. I mean, I've been looking at them, and the neat thing about it is I have colleagues in my department who do not teach history of comics, do not really maybe have an interest in comics, but have begin to use them in their classrooms and found them to be something the students have really responded well to.
You're just reminding me of when I was an undergraduate, I took a mythology class, and this is in the 80s, and the teacher brought in Larry Gonick's Cartoon History of the Universe, which is a great book, and the way, in particular, the way Larry Gonick depicts the Leda and the Swan story is hilarious, but also that Helen of Troy is drawn through the rest of that book with a duck beak, and that that gave us that was the first time I think I ever was in a class in which a literature class anyway, in which a teacher brought in a comic as a supplement to that subject.
So I've been thinking about kind of age gaps, generation gaps. I just went back to school and got my master's degree. And in one of the classes, the professor was talking about New Coke. I was one of 3 people, including the professor, who had heard of New Coke and knew what the story was. I was kind of shocked. It made me feel so much older. I was maybe 5 or 10 years older than a lot of the kids in the class. But so how do you guys as educators address this issue where you wouldn't necessarily think that the students wouldn't even be aware of this subject? Has anything like that come up when you're teaching, and kind of how do you approach the millennials, if you want to use that term?
That just reminds me, this may not be quite answering the question, but the other day Mark Waid tweeted that X-Men 137 came out 35 years ago this week. And I teach the Dark Phoenix saga, but when I teach superheroes, and I don't think of that as a 35-year-old book. And so I think of, well, when that came out, how I was, I guess, 12 years old. What was 35 years old when X-Men 137 came out? And that's World War II. So, and I was into the nostalgia books that Roy Thomas was doing. And so when I think about that, those golden age books were as old to me then as the Dark Phoenix saga is now. and yet that it doesn't seem like, there are ways. So when I teach that, what I have to think about is how is that book written differently, created differently than a comic that they would read today if they got it on the newsstand?
I have a Twitter feed for Hogan's Alley, Hogan Mag. If you want to subscribe to it, follow it. And nice. I do a Today in Comics History fact every day of the week, one fact every day. So in researching that each month for that month's content, I become very aware of the ages of things and when things happen. Like today, for example, I know that Garfield first appeared on this date, 1978. So there you go. Wow. And for example, yeah, there you go. I felt a lot older. And Charlie Brown Christmas will turn 50 this December. There's another one for you. But anyway, as the publisher of Hogan's Alley, I have to assume that our readers have an interest in the historical context of cartooning and the historical underpinnings of comics in general. So I don't feel the need to ease them in or make them become interested in comics history. I assume that they're reading Hogan's Alley because they're into that kind of thing like I am. And, we're fellow travelers in that sense. Do you guys find it's a tough sell to get people into older material? Or?
Well, I mentioned a while ago that I used Ho Che Anderson's King the very first time I taught a comics class. And my very first time teaching a comics class was a little depressing because it was the course that I teach on multi-ethnic American literature, and I made it all comics-based one semester. And I put out ads all over campus, flyers and whatnot, and I thought, everyone loves comics, right? These kids today, and they love their comics.
These kids today.
I found out that I was much more interested and into comics and more knowledgeable about not just the history of comics, but that comics actually exist than my students were. And at times it was annoying and depressing trying to pull them along and get them into the texts. And I learned, or it dawned on me halfway through the semester that, well, the reason why these guys signed up is because they thought they could get an easy A because it's about comics, right? I don't think it was that entirely, but I think almost every student came into class ignorant of not only comics history, but just even contemporary stuff, even comics titles that have been around, less than 10 years. If anything, they had a familiarity with manga, but not what we would call American comics, or let's say non-manga comics and graphic novels. So I felt that I was pulling double duty, not only teaching the text that I was trying to teach, about comics and how they apply to issues of race and ethnicity, but also trying to get my students at least at a minimum up to some speed in terms of what comics are and how they work.
I was shocked the first time I taught the class and every semester since the first day I asked the students, how many of you have read a comic book in the last month? And then how many of you have read a comic book in the last year? And then I asked how many of you have never read a comic book? And literally half the class or more puts their hand up. And this isn't a class that is clearly advertised as comics, right? And so I say, how many of you know who Batman is? Or Iron Man is. Of course, every hand goes up, and everyone knows the movies. But the thing is that very, very few people go from the movies to the books or come out of the books and see the movies. And so for me, the age, I don't know if it's an age gap so much as it's just a difference in terms of the way they come to know the characters and approach the material. The flip side of that is I try to meet them halfway, partly out of necessity. Because I do something, I haven't found a good solution to the issue of having them read individual issues. Like I want them to read, a romance book from the Kirby and Simon from the late 40s, early 50s. Or I want them to read, this issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow by, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. And getting them to do that, digital is the way to do it. And I find that they really like reading the comics digitally. And so that appeals to them, I think, in ways that maybe makes it a bit more accessible to them as millennials.
I had an interesting phenomenon, and I don't know if Will's, the class you teach is in the same kind of boat as mine, because that when I teach comics, I teach them in a class that is a 200 level fiction class. It's not designated comics. Right?
Mine is designated. Yeah, it's a special topic.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a gen ed fiction class that I teach as comics, and the first couple semesters I taught it, I had very kind of small number of students in there, none of whom were expecting a class on comics, and I would get evaluations that would reflect that. But I teach in a pretty small community in South Carolina, and after a few years, I started to notice the students on the first day sitting in the front row wearing their Wolverine and Green Lantern T-shirts and stuff, and wanting, acknowledgement that, we are, I am one of you and you are, so on. We're in the same club. And several of them have come up to me over the years and said that they had a friend who went to the school, found out there was a class on comics, told them in high school students, hey, you go to USC Sumter, you can take a class on comics, and they're doing that. And now the class fills up, and that's kind of an amazing idea to me that you could somehow even use. So number one, I'm starting to get more and more of the students that are familiar and comfortable with comics, but you can use a comics class as a recruiting tool for students. That kind of amazes me.
I mean, to stay with the recruiting tool, my department, several people teach the class that I teach, and that is it's a class, History 200 is what we call it. It's a class designed to teach students who are becoming majors and minors how to use primary sources. And lots of people teach a section of this class. There's an ancient warfare version. There's a witchcraft version. There's mine on comics. It's supposed to be kind of a fun class that will attract students into the major and into the program. And, you know, I've been asked to teach my class basically in perpetuity every spring because there's just a high demand for it because it brings people in.
I will add this. We have a number of universities that subscribe to Hogan's Alley, and I'm always replacing copies that get stolen, which I am very gratified by.
That's a good sign.
Well, my class was actually really weird because it was almost a 50-50 split between men and women, and which I thought was wonderful. And I actually had about half the class said, no, I don't read comics. But one woman in particular, she said, I never read comics, but after understanding comics, I started out with understanding comics, and then I jumped right to Watchmen. And then she's like, wow, I didn't know. I did not know that this was there. You know, we read Mouse, and they're like, wow, I didn't even know this existed. You know, what? Tell me more. You know, it's comics really. I mean, people get excited about comics. I mean, they really do. I mean, I had some hardcore, you know, Wolverine T-shirt guys. You know, hey, what did you think of, you know, this issue, whatever? And wait, hang on, let me back up a second. You know, but it was really. I mean, I really think probably the most successful class. Mine's a once a week class, so we try to do a work a week. And it's, you know, a 3-hour class. So my most successful week was probably Why the Last Man. And we're specifically talking about gender. We're analyzing what goes on with Yorick, you know, in that first, because if we just do the first trade, we can't do the whole series. There's just not enough time. And the class goes from about 6 to 8:45, and I think I ended up getting out of there between 9:30 and 10 that night because they wanted to keep talking about everything that we were, you know, the work. They wanted to talk about the work. And for that one in particular, I mean, we talk about, I even go back, I like to talk about comics history a lot too because, you know, I'm a geek, but in particular, you know, talking about suffrage, you know, women's suffrage, you know, when did they get the vote? Put that in perspective. What year was it, you know, and give them that, and then jump up to what we're seeing in comics now, you know, well, even now and today, you know, we joked about there's a women in comics panel with no women on it, right? But that particular class, I think, I mean, it was the entire class was good, but that one particular class teaching that one particular work seemed to strike a nerve when I taught it, and it was really interesting.
Yeah. Will, what you just said about Why the Last Man, and Brian, what you said about wanting to teach things like Green Lantern, Green Arrow, make me raise a question for me: is there an issue of access for certain things that you wish you could teach, but are kind of, you know, can you do? You can't do 10 volumes of Why the Last Man in a class, or how do you get them access to Golden Age comics if you want to show them Golden Age comics?
Well, for me, I do. There's the Golden Age Archive. There's a couple of really good sites out there that do everything that's out of copyright, and I try to give them those links. We do. I guess I shill for Comicology because I tell them that they can order the books there, or they can buy the physical copies. I'm old school. I like to have the paper. I'm an
for
old
things
guy.
like that, you can put certain books, collections, archival collections, graphic novels, what have you, individual issues on reserve in your library, and it's kind of cumbersome. I don't know how many people, professors, teachers, do that anymore, but I mean that is one option. But to me, the question of the single issue, and this may not have much to do with history. I mean, that's been one of the biggest challenges as someone who teaches comics. You know, how much, if at all, do you want to rely on a single issue? I mean, I can't justify having students buy one book, let's say a trade where there's just one issue collected in that trade that I want to focus on in class, So do I tell them to? And Comixology may be a good option, maybe a much more affordable option than that. And then also you mentioned Why the Last Man. I haven't taught that, although I've wanted to. I think that's a great example. With me, it is Jason Aaron's Scout, and I have taught, I think, Volume 1, and separately another time I taught Volume 2 of Scout. And I think those work okay. The best that comes of that, I think, is introducing them to the first trade of, let's say, Why the Last Man or Scout. And now you can go on and read the rest of it. This is sending forth. Go read great comics, my sons and daughters now. But yeah, and that's one of the reasons why, I said earlier, there's some texts that are the usual suspects. Those are usually the self-contained graphic novels that a lot of people know about, so they immediately, and they're very teachable, right? Unlike the unwieldy Sandman or Scout or
Volume 4, I did, what's Volume 4?
Season of Mist?
No, not the one, the single, the one-shots. It has...
Yes.
Yes, that's the one. Mainly because
trivia.
Volume 1 doesn't really hit. Gaiman is not hitting his stride there, and until number 8. So I wanted to get more of a feel for the series as it was than what it started out as. But talking about single issues, I think we're to a point where the individual issues are almost like artifacts.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to teach. Hey, I can show you Triumph of the Will, the Nazi propaganda film, but you wouldn't do that on a projector with 35 millimeter film anymore.
I'm waiting for the comics version of that.
Comics version, okay. And I really think that's kind of where those single issues, they're these things that how it came out, but this is the story, and you can get it in one package now on your tablet or in trade or whatever.
Well, I rely on single issues a lot, actually, and so the solutions I've been able to come up with, the Digital Comic Museum online is excellent.
That's one.
I have them read Young Romance, and it's from that, and I pick an issue, and that's what we talk about that day. Otherwise, on the first day, I talk to them about the fact that, the class will require them to have a Comixology account. They'll need to purchase the things that we use in the class. And I ask them, at the end of the semester, is this a big deal for you all? It's not really a major expense at $1.99. I think they buy 10 issues. It's $20. So, it's Superman 1, it's Cap 1, it's Fantastic Four 1. Things that they need along the way. And without exception, I think they've all said they would much prefer to do that and read them and be responsible for them as opposed to, $20 might get you one trade.
Yeah.
And this way, it's basically 10 readings, multiple weeks, and they're thrilled with it. And they also, again, they like the digital. They like having it with them. They bring it to the class with their iPad or whatever, and they're happy.
Well, I teach a lot of... Well, I'm a Warren Ellis. That's what I wrote my dissertation on, was Ellis and postmodernism, and you don't want to read it, trust me. But Planetary is one of those things that I teach, mainly because I just love it, and also because he brings in so many things about comics and comics history. The Four being the Fantastic Four, thinly disguised, and the stand-ins he uses for, Doc Savage, which brings in the pulp heroes and talking about the Wold Newton and all that fun, cool stuff. But, giving them a history of why he thinks, Ellis's supposition is that, superheroes killed every other genre. And they literally do in the book. But, and trying to teach that, that comics used to be very rich in in genre. There was romance, there was all these kind of sports comics. There's all this stuff, but yet we only have superheroes left now, pretty much. Crime, lots of crime comics, but there's so much in that one work that gets into placing it historically. There's a line that Snow says. Close your ears. The things these bastards have cost us since 1961, specifically referring to the Fantastic Four, as they killed every other genre. And trying to, put that in perspective. You mentioned, to me, the 80s is kind of when I was reading. The 60s are always 20 years ago for me. And the 40s were 40 years ago, so I'm kind of lagging, I guess. But, teaching all that, because all that stuff is bound up in those pages, which, and I think the students need to know it, and I think they want to know it too, because it adds layers and depth and gives them more full experience, I guess, or fuller experience.
I was just thinking something you said earlier about teaching the Sandman Volume 1. Like you'd have to explain the Giffen Demadius JLA and why that's not the Justice League they would have expected.
Justice League is supposed to be,
there's a lot of stuff. But on another note, I just was recently at Ohio State University's Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, which is a fabulous resource for studying comics, and they just recently acquired a copy of All Negro Comics #1 from 1947. So I got a chance to look at that, and that's been in my research on, especially the research I've done on race and comics. That's been kind of the holy grail for me to try to find that book. It's there are very few copies in existence, and what's on the Digital Comics Museum is an incomplete copy. And so I spent a very long time with this artifact, and I put it back in the folder. I stood up, and there were just pieces of it all over my clothes because it's so fragile. And how much longer is this? I probably shouldn't say that. I'm going to be banned from that place from now on. But how long is it? These artifacts last like that?
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll open it up to some audience questions. We've kind of touched on this a little bit. So how problematic is the notion of historical accuracy in graphic novels? Like, is there this idea of truth? I know you guys kind of try to bring in the primary sources when you kind of educate on kind of graphic novels and comics, but have you ever had any kind of like issues with truth and historical accuracy?
Well, at least the comics that I've either taught or spoken or written about, for the most part, the questioning of objectivity, I think, is woven within the very fabric of the comic, and I think that those are the most successful ones. I mean, I come back to an example I used earlier, Ho Che Anderson's King. Not only do you have that presented in kind of a fragmented way, but it also shows a side of Martin Luther King that if people aren't familiar with, then it's not one that they often acknowledge. And I think that can rub some readers, some students, the wrong way. But again, if Anderson was attempting to be historically accurate in showing the less than attractive side of Martin Luther King as well as what he's best known for, the attractive side, then he's being truer to a subject than, let's say, creating him as some kind of myth. If you have historical narratives in comic form that are told from multiple perspectives, or, for instance, told from one particular observer's point of view, then that places that history within a context, and it doesn't profess to be anything out there objective and a godlike account of what actually happened. And I think that it's up to us as not only educators, but editors and publishers to underscore this fact that, as with any text, not just comics. This is not specific to the comics medium, but that these manuscripts aren't handed down from on high, that they come with their own baggage, they come with their own context and limitations. Now let's talk about what those contexts and limitations are. And I think that a lot of the comics that I've, spoken and written about in the past, do that very thing.
That just makes me think, just to emphasize one book that I teach that deals with history and where we talk about history a lot is Kyle Baker's Nat Turner. And I've written about this too. And that is such an interesting, it's unique as a comic in what it does anyway. And it makes some very interesting comments on history in general. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Baker includes the entire text of the Confession of Nat Turner, which is a historical document of some questions about its credibility and so on. But it's allegedly a first person narrative in which Nat Turner, who led a slave revolt in Southampton, Virginia, that killed 55 white people, was so that the confession, it was again a historical document that was published at the time, and then what Baker does then is have a virtually silent comic narrative weaved throughout the text that sometimes illustrates what's in the confession, but very often it gives different information, sometimes contradictory information to what's in the confession. And so that book really kind of destabilizes this idea of truth. What is the truth? Is the confession the truth? Is, Baker's version of the story the truth, which contains a whole bunch? The confession, for example, doesn't mention the fact that Nat Turner was married and had children. Baker makes the separation of the family a key element of the revolution, which is not in any of the other historical narratives or fictional narratives, if you include William Styron's novel, The Confession of Nat Turner. So we really get into, and when I teach that book, that idea of, well, where is the truth? What do you privilege out of these things? And that also then gets into the idea with students of the word text combination or image text combination of comics, and they find themselves saying, I actually kind of privilege the images in the book over the text, and that leads to interesting discussions.
Well, one of the things I do, even in my comp class, is first day, perspective and bias.
Mm-hmm.
I say, for your information, I'm going to tell you stuff, but I'm a pinko commie tree hugging hippie socialist, so I have that perspective. He sometimes gets a laugh even. So anyway, but I want them to know that everything, and I probably wore this word out with my sons. Think about what you're consuming. Think about it, not just comics. Think about, the books you read, the news you watch. Think about the perspective. Think about the biases that are there. You don't have to agree with me, but think about these things. And if I do anything at all in the class, if I get them to just think, then I think that's a win, at least from my standpoint, because don't just mindlessly consume things. Where are they coming from? What is their bias? Of course, I always bring up Fox News. I have, there's Fox News, there's MSNBC, there's, what are these biases that these sources of your information, what are their biases? And I hope that they take that to heart. I really do.
Well, I was going to say, just real quick, piggybacking off that, because, that reminds me of what you said, Will, and what Andy was talking about. Something else that I've used in the classroom, and I think it's quite effective at dealing with this question of objectivity, or at least your subject position, where you're coming from, the context of you as a writer or illustrator, is Joe Sacco's Palestine. And, he's known for, comics journalism primarily, not solely, but I would even call that a form of history, because he's writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one of the things I love about that book, and I always emphasize in the classroom, is that it is primarily from a Palestinian point of view. But what Sacco does so strategically toward the very end of that text is he brings in an Israeli perspective. There's this chapter where he is talking to two Israeli women, and they question him about his position on the Palestinian question. Well, you're probably not going to paint us in the most positive of lights. And they have a dialogue back and forth, and in many ways, it kind of, in almost a metafictional way, kind of underscores his project in Palestine, which is to give another point of view of a historical situation that hasn't been addressed, at least from that perspective, frequently. And so, whenever I teach that, I like to emphasize that it may be the penultimate chapter, but it's toward the very end of the book, where he does bring in an Israeli point of view to kind of question him as an objective reporter.
Joe Kubert did a book,
Facts from Sarajevo.
Yeah,
Right.
Have you guys taught that at all, or?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't either. It's one of those that I wanted. It's on my to-read list, which is like taller than me now. But,
All right, audience, any questions? Okay, in the back.
doing next semester we're going to have 2 sections of community with first year composition. That would be about half the time each student. I was thinking maybe be doing with doctors and things. So do you have any thoughts on? So do any of you have any thoughts on doing the rest of the classes?
So, in case you guys didn't hear that, the question was, are there any kind of particular comics that you would use to teach non-Western history?
Or what approach would you use to teach comics? If you use comics to teach history to be your national students?
I would be really fascinated to find out how Boxers and Saints goes over, because I think that's a really rich book to teach on many levels. It's as a really complex narrative and as history. So, and I think you could get, especially with the Chinese students, you're explaining what do they learn? What did they learn growing up about this event? And how does the book reflect that?
Because for me, the question, piggybacking on that, would be, well, if you're trying to reach, non-Western students by introducing a text that was created by a Western artist, because, Gene Yang, he may be Chinese American, but, he is Western. That's going to cause its own kind of challenges, not problems, but challenges. Mm-hmm. And I think it could be fruitful grist for the classroom, where you can maybe contrast where your students are coming from in their understanding of that part of their history and the way that this Chinese American comics artist has represented that history.
Not just Chinese American, but Chinese American Catholic. And Yang's deeply, deeply Catholic, and that gets into Will's earlier point about perspective and bias.
Do you speak Chinese? I don't either. I barely speak English, I've been told. If you did, then introducing a work by a Chinese artist, I think, would be an amazing thing to do. But like I said, I barely read and comprehend English most days. So another language is, but that's something that in Northwest Arkansas, we have a lot of Hispanic students. And like I said, I don't even speak Spanish, but I would think that would be a way to try to reach by finding a work by an author that is a native speaker, or, from that. Just a guess.
And you had a question?
Yeah. I phrased this question differently initially in my head, and I'm trying to rephrase it to the comment that you made a few moments ago. Do you address the censorship of the Comics Code Authority in the wake of Wargham's Seduction of the Innocent, and how it wasn't just superheroes' popularity as a genre, but it was actually American censorship that killed our multi-audience appeal with comics, and how that's part of the reason why manga is so popular now, is because they actually do have comics for women, comics for girls, comics for every different audience, not just hyper-sanitized comics cleaned up for little boys that we've been dealing with since the 50s.
Yeah, I do talk about Wortham, and he's kind of, I don't talk well about him. Well, and if you look at his methodology, it was crap science. Pardon my French. Would you guys agree with that? It was crap science.
You can say worse things than.
There have been studies to prove your statement. So.
But yeah, I do talk about that. Talk about the censorship. Burning books in the 50s. It wasn't just comics. It was the 50s in America was not a place I would want to live, especially being, a pinko commie like I am. But it was, we have to put that in historical perspective. And I don't teach works from that era. Mine is pretty much a survey class of more modern stuff. We go back to Watchmen and Mouse, but more recent stuff. But I do try to give them that historical context of, comics started in the 1800s. If you go back with, Rudolph Topfer and then that stuff, mention that. Go into the 30s, Funnies on Parade, and give them that kind of overview of comics history in a capsule, maybe in a couple of hours. But definitely talk about Wortham and, the evils in the name of censorship.
But even in Watchmen, Wortham factors in, right? That there's the idea that Wortham doesn't get any traction in that world because they want to promote.
Yeah.
The government wants to promote comics as propaganda.
Because they have their own superhero.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you're asked the question about Wortham, and I think it's. I mean, I don't want to excuse anything that he did in terms of what he did to comics. I agree, but I think that by creating him as the big bad is a big problem because, and this becomes an opportunity to introduce history back into the conversation. I mean, the more you dig into Wortham, or at least the more I dig into Wortham, the more, I don't want to say sympathetic. Okay, I'll go ahead and say just almost sympathetic that I feel to his plight as a whole, because this is someone who came from a more social democrat, Frankfurt School, even Marxist background. And so some of his other views outside of comics may resonate with you.
Yeah.
And so learning how he just got it so wrong and how he even purposefully skewed a lot of the information that he was releasing. You can't get around that, but at least his intentions in a larger philosophical way of what he was bringing to an analysis of pop culture, as kind of whacked out as it was at times. Yeah. I mean, he was coming, I think a thorough study of Wortham and his relationship to not only comics, but just popular culture at the time is another avenue to bring in a broader sweep of pop culture in the historical context of the West at that time.
I would completely agree with that, and I would also say that he might have been, his methodology is discredited. He was perhaps well-intentioned but misguided. But I think the larger question with him is, how could one man have such an effect on a medium? No other academics challenged it. The media didn't challenge it. I mean, he had such an outsized platform that he should not have been given. I think that's the real question. How come no other studies or no other academics offered a countervailing opinion?
Well, I think this goes back to comics has always kind of been considered a second-class medium, and the people that work in comics have always kind of considered it less than ideal. You had the early artists, the original first-generation comics artists. They were working in comics until they could get into the comic strips where the money was, right? I mean, it was kind of, I'm slumming, basically. And I don't know, comics has always had that kind of, longing for respectability, I think. I don't think that's too far out of field.
I used to interview Will Allred for Kitchen Sink's reprint series, and he said that in conversation about what you do for a profession, back then comic book artists would say they were commercial illustrators. Comic book artists were one step above pornographers, as he put it. So you would never say you were a comic book artist, you were a commercial illustrator, unless you worked in comic strips. Then you were a celebrity. That's right.
How many people have read Seduction of the Innocent, by the way? Right. Okay. A couple parts. I mean, there's things in which, not just with methodology. I mean, he is right about, for example, issues of race in comics in the 1950s. I mean, he's, whether or not he can document any effect it has on the young readers. When he nails, Jungle Comics for being, for depicting, racist depictions of natives, he's absolutely right.
Well, you go back to the, depiction of the Japanese.
Oh, yeah. And he does that, he hits on that too.
So I'll point out that it is after 4. The panel has already wrapped up, but we can stay a little bit over. There's not another panel until 5, the Inkwells. So I think you had a question. Yeah, Blue Shirt, if you want to go and maybe we can talk a little bit longer. Wish we had 3 hours to these panels, but we don't.
I have a pedagogical question. What strategies in the classroom to get students to use active reading, like annotations, reflections, dialogue, journals, etc.?
Annotations is always the big problem. I don't have a problem writing in a prose novel. and making notes, but I'm still so much of a collector if I were to start writing in a comic. So I bring in my copy. Like, my copy of Watchmen is twice as thick as it should be because it's got sticky notes in it. And so that, when you're talking about annotations, that's definitely one of the things I recommend. Get a load of sticky notes and use that to mark up your book.
I second that, because that's what I do. I don't write in my comics. Journaling is another way of doing it, is having them, and maybe even grading that, taking it up once a week, whatever their reflections are, their thoughts, whether they liked it or not. It doesn't have to be an intellectual reaction, but just writing something down, I think, is a great way of getting some kind of student reaction.
I make them respond multiple times a semester, and that, to me, that's kind of a one-page response in some way to the reading. And I give them flexibility. I mean, I ask them to do maybe 8 over the course of the semester, so if they don't have a strong response or reaction to something, they can pass on it. But multiple times, I want them writing about it and thinking about it, and not describing it, but analyzing it. I mean, that's the whole point. I said, I've read it too. We all read it. Tell me something that you took from it that had an impact on you. Talk about what there's going on there in some way, what the author's trying to say, or what bias you detect, or what the message is there that you interpreted. And that makes them kind of sink their teeth into it a little bit more.
Do you find that there's a learning curve with those responses? Because I do that too, and those first couple, they're so nervous. What do you want from me with this? What do you want from me with this? And it's just like, don't worry about it. Yeah. You've got 5 or 6 of these to do. You'll get it.
I also low stress graded it, if that is a possible thing. I'm a fan of, for this type of assignment, kind of a check plus, check minus. People, they get a B plus back or a B minus back, and they freak out at check plus, check minus. In my grade book, it's I take a note of what it was, and it's such a small part of the grade over the semester. It doesn't mean a lot, but it makes them do something. And if they zero them, that obviously has a very big impact. But just doing it and thinking about it and turning something in and maybe not being timid about it is the key.
I guess I was lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view. My class was really pretty small. It was about 10 people. So it made, yay. But we did a lot of discussion. It was small enough that we could just talk. We would talk about, what did you get at? Why is Rorschach so appealing to you? Or, what specific thing, did you respond to in this? It's a lot of discussion. My grading was a lot of, attendance quizzes, pretty much is what it came down to. Come in, who wrote what we were, the work that we're talking about. But the point of the class, in my mind, was getting them talking with each other and talking with me about these works and their responses to these works.
Red shirt, did you have a question?
Yeah. I was talking with the director of my department. I work at a very small Christian college in Mississippi. And I kind of have to do this thing where I say, hey, what about fluff? And get the response before I actually finally present it. But I came up with this idea. I was like, hey, I would love to teach mythology and continue that through the 20th century, and then about half the class be about comics. And I said that, and my parents kind of looked at me like I was an idiot. So do you all have any pointers about how I could teach this as an intellectual practice that has merit, not just changing the comic book?
Well, one of the most successful books about mythology, I think, I read was, William Mesner Loeb and Sam Keith.
Epicurus
the Sage, yes. It's a comedy. It's maybe not the best for a Christian college, but you have so many of the stories and the characters in there, and they're so memorable the way they're presented that there were some stories about mythology that, I've of course read the handbooks and all the everything, but there were some things in there that I'm like, oh, I'd forgot that I'd even read about. I loved it. And there's like 3, 4, 5 volumes of it or something out there, I think. Simonson's Thor.
Yeah. When I took mythology in college, I remember it being so easy because I'd read Wonder Woman. And Thor. But, you're asking the question of how do you overcome kind of administrative barriers to comics, and that's, the weakest answer I can give is that, that's changing now. It's getting better, but that there's scholarship out there. I mean, there are journals devoted to comics, academic journals, peer-reviewed academic journals devoted to comics. If your administrators are receptive to that idea that comics are a legitimate subject of study by academics, maybe that can help. I don't know.
And if it's any consolation, my first teaching gig, I had administrative hardships getting a film studies course approved, and this is an area of study with decades of back history, and they still didn't consider it legitimate enough. Now I was able to overcome that. So we could be asking this question several decades from now about comics.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I know a large portion of the audience has left, but thank you, everyone, for coming. Don't forget to check out Comics Alternative Podcast. They do have a table downstairs.
Yeah.
They have postcards. Don't forget to check out Hogan's Alley, and don't forget to take comics classes at your university or teach them. Thank you so much to everybody. And don't forget, you can listen to the panel at thedollarben.com.net. Geez, whatever. Long day. Thanks, everybody.
So we had a good time on that panel, and I think you can get a sense of that from listening to it, that it was a nice freewheeling conversation, but not real. We didn't get really controversial, I don't think, in any sense.
No, it was definitely not a high stakes panel. Sometimes when you go to academic conferences, and it can be painful. You're at some panels where people have certain axes to grind, or there's just some kind of contention going on. There's something in the air. I've been to a number of those, and while they're entertaining, sometimes they're not the most content heavy compared to the argumentative amount of info that you get. But this one, I think, was a very productive conversation. It was congenial, and I talked with everyone, as you did, afterwards, and just would see them every now and again at the con, just passing them on the floor or coming by our table. Really nice people, and I'm glad I got to know them.
Yeah, I am glad too. And we had a good crowd. That's one of the things I like about doing that panel. Is, again, to make the comparison to an academic conference, we can often do an academic conference where there's, 3 or fewer people in the audience at a panel, and here we had a really good crowd, and they were lively. They had questions at the end, and we even went a little overtime, and we could have probably gone on for quite a while, and then the conversation continued into the hallway.
That's right. So I hope that you guys listening to this had as much fun listening as Andy and I did participating on the panel. So it was great.
Yep.
And, many of the books that we referred to, the panelists referred to during that event, you can find those titles at the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service, or better yet, since they're already published books, In-Stock Trades. So whether you use dcbservice.com or instocktrades.com, you can't go wrong. A great place to get your funny books. And after you do order your comics there, be sure to get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see a tab on the right-hand side of your browser that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's just that simple. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at the Comics Alternative at comicsalternative.com. That's two guys at comicsalternative.com. You can get a hold of us individually. I am Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And then you can also get a hold of us on Twitter, or find us on Twitter, where we post updates to the podcast as well as new content to the blog, you can check out our Twitter feed at @2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google+. You can also get our podcast through our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can also stream us on Stitcher, and you can find us on TuneIn. And you can always find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and find out what we're doing.
And we like to hear from you, so get in touch. And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.